I still remember the moment I realized I was tired of living the same cycle over and over again. For years, I kept telling myself, this is the last time. I would make promises late at night when the guilt felt heavy and the disappointment felt unbearable. I would wake up the next morning determined to change, convinced that I finally had enough willpower. Then a few days would pass, maybe a week if I was lucky, and somehow I would find myself right back where I started. What hurt the most wasn't the habit itself. It was the feeling that I was losing respect for myself. I began to notice how my confidence was shrinking. I avoided looking people in the eyes for too long. I stopped believing my own promises. Every time I said I would change and didn't, a small part of me stopped trusting me. That loss of self-trust became heavier than the habit itself. For a long time, I thought the solution was simply to fight harder. I tried using pure willpower. I deleted apps. I made strict rules. I counted days. I punished myself when I failed. None of it worked for very long. The harder I fought myself, the more exhausted I became. One night I asked myself a question that changed everything. What if the real problem isn't that I'm weak? What if I'm trying to solve this the wrong way? That question forced me to be honest. I realized I had spent years treating the symptom while ignoring the reasons behind it. Whenever I felt lonely, stressed, rejected, anxious, bored, or overwhelmed, I reached for the same escape. The habit had become my coping mechanism. That realization was uncomfortable because it meant I couldn't simply hate myself into becoming better. I had to understand myself. I started paying attention to the moments when the urges appeared. Patterns became obvious. The temptation was strongest when I was isolated. It was strongest after a stressful day. It was strongest when I felt like I wasn't good enough. The behavior wasn't random. It was connected to emotions I didn't know how to handle. For years I had been using temporary pleasure to avoid temporary pain. The problem was that the pleasure lasted minutes, while the emptiness lasted much longer. I also noticed something else. The more shame I carried, the more likely I was to repeat the behavior. Shame would tell me, you've already failed. You're already messed up. Why even try? And because I believed that voice, I would fall deeper into the cycle. That was the moment I understood that shame was not helping me heal. It was helping me stay stuck. So I made a different decision. Instead of asking, how do I stop hating myself? I asked, how do I become the kind of person who no longer needs this escape? That question changed my focus completely. I stopped obsessing over streaks and started rebuilding my life. I began with simple things. I cleaned my room. I started exercising even when I didn't feel motivated. I went for walks without my phone. I slept at reasonable hours. I spent less time alone online. None of these actions seemed dramatic, but together they began to change something inside me. For the first time in years, I felt movement. I won't pretend the urges disappeared overnight. They didn't. Some days were incredibly difficult. There were moments when my mind tried to convince me that one relapse would make me feel better. Sometimes I listened to that voice. Sometimes I failed. But I started responding differently. Instead of turning one mistake into a week of self-destruction, I learned to stand back up immediately. I stopped saying, I ruined everything. I started saying, I had a setback, but I'm still moving forward. That difference may sound small, but it changed my entire recovery. I also had to confront another painful truth. I had tied my worth to my failures. I believed that because I struggled, I was somehow less valuable than other people. I looked at confident people and assumed they were naturally stronger, cleaner, or more disciplined than me. What I eventually learned is that every person is fighting battles you cannot see. Some people struggle with anger. Some struggle with addiction. Some struggle with pride, fear, dishonesty, or loneliness. My struggle did not make me worthless. It made me human. That realization brought relief I hadn't felt in years. I remember sitting alone one evening after another difficult day, and for the first time I spoke to myself with compassion instead of contempt. I said, you are not beyond change. You are not broken forever. You are a person who has learned unhealthy ways to cope, and you can learn healthier ones. I didn't fully believe those words yet, but I needed to hear them. Change began slowly. I started noticing that my mind felt clearer after a few days of discipline. My energy improved. Conversations became easier. I felt more present with people. I laughed more naturally. I wasn't constantly carrying the weight of secrecy. The biggest transformation, however, was happening internally. I was beginning to trust myself again. Every small victory mattered. Going to bed instead of scrolling for hours mattered. Taking a walk when an urge hit mattered. Calling a friend instead of isolating myself mattered. Choosing discomfort in the moment created strength for the future. One lesson became especially important. Urges are temporary. For years, I treated every urge like an emergency. I thought I had to satisfy it immediately, or I would lose control. But when I finally started observing the feeling instead of obeying it, I discovered something surprising. An urge rises, peaks, and eventually fades. It feels powerful, but it does not last forever. Learning to sit with discomfort was one of the hardest skills I ever developed. Modern life teaches us to escape every uncomfortable emotion instantly. We distract ourselves, entertain ourselves, numb ourselves, and avoid silence. But growth often begins when we stop running from discomfort. There were nights when I wanted to give up completely. I thought, maybe this is just who I am. Those were dangerous moments, because hopelessness can become a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you believe change is impossible, you stop taking the actions that make change possible. So I stopped asking whether I felt capable of changing. I started acting like someone who was changing, even on days when my emotions disagreed. That distinction matters. Feelings are unreliable leaders. Some mornings you wake up motivated. Other mornings you wake up discouraged. If your future depends entirely on your emotions, your progress will constantly rise and fall. Discipline means choosing your values even when your feelings are unstable. As the weeks passed, I began noticing something unexpected. The battle wasn't only about stopping a habit. It was about becoming a different person. A person who faced stress directly. A person who handled loneliness honestly. A person who pursued purpose instead of escape. I started asking myself difficult questions. Why am I avoiding real connection? What pain am I trying not to feel? What kind of life do I actually want? Those questions were uncomfortable, but they led me toward healing instead of temporary relief. If you're listening to this right now, and you feel trapped in the same cycle I lived in for years, I want you to hear something clearly. Struggling does not mean you are doomed. Failing does not mean you are finished. Feeling ashamed does not mean you are unworthy of respect. The first step is not perfection. The first step is honesty. Honesty about the habit. Honesty about the emotions underneath it. Honesty about the fact that you are tired of living divided against yourself. That was the beginning of my journey. Not a dramatic overnight transformation. Not a miracle. Just a quiet decision to stop running and start rebuilding my life one choice at a time. And looking back now, that small decision became the foundation for everything that changed afterward.